Cody. I am the lead naturalist here at the Nature Center. I know most of you here, so welcome back. Tonight we have Gary Ivey here, who wears an awful lot of hats. Most recently, he's on the board. He's the president of the Friends of Mount Here Wildlife, on the board for the Trumpeter Swan Society, which is what most of the presentation is about today, and also
I work part-time for the International Crane
Foundation. So cranes and swans is definitely his thing. So we brought Gary back tonight. We had him in last year about the same time to talk about Trumpeter Swans, the Trumpeter Swan Society, and the conservation efforts of the group, and kind of what Gary does. And so we brought him back to give us an update on what's going on with that. He's got some information. He'll talk about a lot of things that's been happening. I'm sure you guys can notice some things have happened with swans, and some good, some bad. We also have Wray here, who's from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he said he'd be happy after the presentation to help field some questions as well. So without taking up too much of your time, I want everybody to welcome Gary Ivey out, and thank you all for coming.
Before I get started talking, I wanted Simon up here too. There were some questions, I think, from this group about the two young baby cygnets that were here that went to Summer Lake, and one of them didn't make it, and what's happened with that. And I can give you a little background. As I understand, about the middle of October hunting season down at Summer Lake where they were released, started about the 8th of October. About a week later, some hunters shot two trumpeter swans. One of them was one of those young birds from here at Sun River, and the other one was a bird that's still alive and in rehab. It may, we've been talking about this the last couple of days, but it may have to be euthanized because it's not healing very well, but we're still trying to do what we can to get it saved. But so it's a tragedy. So I'm sure you have some questions about that.
What happened to him?
Last I heard, the guy hunting Oregon, and he lives, his residence is in Washington, so he was hunting under a Oregon hunting license, and he's not an Oregon resident for one thing. But they haven't taken the case to the district attorney yet. It's going to go before the guy in Lakeview, but the state police are still working on the case. And he admitted that he killed the bird outright, the one bird, but he did not admit that he had killed or injured the other bird, and another hunter observed that. So there's going to be some kind of court hearing at some point, and I don't know what. It's up to the DA and the judge what kind of penalties and fines they get. We hope that at least he pays restitution. So far, the medical bills just on this bird that's in rehab has been about almost $6,000. And if they have to go back and do surgery now, the wing bone isn't healing. It's probably going to be at least that much more. And so we hope that the judge will take that into consideration and give the guy a big fine. We don't know what is going to happen. That's really up to the court system. You want to say something?
No, it's basically the injury was the wrist, and then the ulnus and the radius was shattered, and the ulna was broken, and they pinned it all together. They've taken the pins out. There's a plate on the ulna, and that appears to be healing nicely, but there was a big scab over the radius, and a couple of days ago it finally fell off, and it didn't reveal a nice pink fleshy area. It revealed the bone, the naked bone.
Oh.
So, which leaves us with some options, whether to amputate from the elbow down, but that's an issue because they use their wings for insulation in the wintertime. We know how cold it is here. There's no guarantee the swan would survive. She probably, because there's nothing there, there's just bone, she probably has more of an infection that she's actually showing. She doesn't show, she's on antibiotics, she doesn't show any signs of being sick. But birds can be like that. They can be incredibly stoic and look just fine, and they just drop dead. So there's a lot of work that would need to be done if we're going to get her in a position where we could bring her back into more of a captive breeding situation. And we're going through all the options. We've talked to as many vets as we can. No one's really gone beyond this point. At the main vet for ODFW, who's done surgery on thousands of birds. So essentially, if you have this kind of a breakage, it's euthanasia right out the gun. So we'll see. Things don't look good. We're doing the best we can. We haven't made the decision to euthanize or not at this point, but that's probably what's going to happen.
Do
I understand that the hunter mistook the swan and then you had another swan as a game bird, and that's why they were shooting more.
You know, any way you cut it, it was a violation. It's absolutely the responsibility of anyone who's out there to legally hunt to know the difference between what you can legally shoot and what you cannot. Swans, there's no open season at all for
Yeah,
swans.
I wouldn't think so.
So if they're shot, then that's a legal take. And when you go out to Summer Lake, you'll see that there are signs out there that show the difference between a snow goose and a swan. And those are really the two species that you would expect to get mixed up. And so there's an educational process to try to teach hunters, and really it's been pretty successful. There's been, since 2009, there's only been 4 hunter-killed swans at Summer Lake. In the same period, we've lost 9 swans to power line strikes. So there's other things that will kill them too. You know, even 4 is too many. We would like it to be 0. But Summer Lake is the best place to take these cygnets and release them because it has the best habitat, the best food, and you know, these young birds need the ability to fly around and move around, and it gives them the best opportunity to get to the 4 or 5 years necessary before they start to breed themselves. And
They also have large sanctuaries there where the swans can go and
with no hunting.
get away from the hunting. And most other areas that are wetlands around Oregon are hunted and don't have those sanctuaries. So, you know, if we took them to Upper Klamath Lake, that's all hunted. And nobody's watching there. Summer Lake, they keep pretty close tabs on their hunters and what goes on. So, and also Summer Lake is the only approved site by the Pacific Flyway where we can actually release swans because there's a process we have to go through with the federal government and the state partners. All the state agencies have a waterfowl coordinator that's part of the Pacific Flyway, and they approve sites, so they have to be certified that they have plenty of wetlands and lots of aquatic foods, and there's a big process to go through to get approval for a release site. So it's not easy to say, okay, we're going to put them somewhere else because they might get shot at Summer Lake. It's
How much acreage does a nesting pair need?
their territories, they're territorial during the breeding season, so it depends on the size of the wetland they select. Sometimes they're on, usually about, at the minimum, about 30-acre pond, but the bigger the better. Their bigger territories are probably about a square mile sometimes, and they're very aggressive, keeping the other swans out of their nesting area during the summer. I'll talk some about their biology a little bit in my talk.
So is that why you can't keep more than just 2 here at Sun River?
Right. If we had 2 pairs here, they would not nest, they'd fight. They would never lay eggs. If you had a different pond further away, you might have another pair, but yeah, it's a tough deal.
Do any of the swans go to any of these other lakes around here at all and winter over? Like Wickiup or Grand Prairie? I mean, I've never
They
seen
come through in
any
migration,
there,
but the trumpeter swans are pretty rare in the Cascades. Most of them are flying a little further east, and
Right.
I'll talk about the numbers at Summer Lake as they're changing, they're growing, their migrants and where they're coming from. But here at the Cascade Lakes, not so much. More towards the Malheur Refuge Country and Summer Lake and Warner Basin. That's where the migration goes through, and they end up in Klamath also, but where all the wetlands are.
Over the past 2 years, we've had 4 wild swans come and hang out on Lake Aspen.
There were some trumpeters, one, yeah. So they're coming through here, but real low numbers, and they don't spend the winter here
Yeah,
generally.
No.
they don't stay, okay.
Yeah, the historic wintering grounds are California, and that's probably where these birds are moving through or going. It's in the Central Valley, Sacramento Valley. Any other questions about that? My talks are very informal, and if you have a question or for me or Simon as we go along, just, we'll go wherever you want to go, but I just have this kind of set program I've got here, but we'll talk about some of these issues a little bit.
We just wanted to make sure that was addressed up front, and
Yeah.
we get an opportunity to answer all your questions.
Yeah, some people asked, I think before, why don't we just leave the young here and let them free fly here? The problem is it's not a good place for them to find mates and getting married and raise more swans, and especially it takes them about 4 or 5 years to reach maturity. In the meantime, there's all these power lines and across the river, and we had some free flying in Bend for a few years. We lost about half of those birds that were flying because of the lines along the river. They're crossing the river and they're very susceptible to power lines, so it's better that they're out in the wild. Okay. And if there's some question you want to answer along this time, and just go ahead. Is this good for the video right here?
Yeah.
Okay. So I started working with Trumpeter Swans. Saw my first Trumpeter Swan in 1979. I was just out of Humboldt State with a wildlife degree, working on a nesting study, and there was a pair of swans nesting in one of my plots. And kind of fell in love with Trumpeter Swans then. But now here I'll talk quite a bit about Malheur Refuge. You know, it's been in the news the last year. A lot of issues and problems at Malheur. It's one of the biggest refuges in the country, a wetland refuge, 187,000 acres. Anyway, so in 1980, we started a study at Malheur that I started up and ran for 8 years. And then in the meantime, in 83, I got a permanent job there, and I was there as a biologist for 15 years working on the swans. And I've kept with the swans even after I left the government in 1998. I left my job, and I've still been working with swans all this time. So I kind of keep track of the swans in Oregon. Kind of one of my personal missions. I also work with sandhill cranes, and mostly in Oregon, but also Alaska and British Columbia and California, most wintering grounds, and a little bit in Nevada and Idaho, Washington. Maybe someday I'll come up and talk about cranes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our Oregon Restoration Program, and these are our partners. It's primarily a partnership with Oregon Fish and Wildlife and the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, and the Trumpeter Swan Society. We've gotten some grants from several different groups over the years. Oregon Wildlife in particular has given us 3 grants, Mountaineers Foundation, the Charlotte Martin Foundation, and we got some small grants from locally, East Cascades Audubon Society, and just this last December, we got one from the Klamath Audubon Society. So how do you tell a trumpeter swan? Most of the swans that you see are not trumpeter swans. And if you're out birding, how many of you are bird watchers? Other than around us? If you're out looking for swans and trying to identify them, it's a challenge because they're very similar. There are 2 native swans in North America, the tundra swan. Does this thing have a pointer on it?
Yeah. Maybe on the top of it.
There we go. Here's the tundra swan, which is also here. And trumpeter swan, these 2 are native, and this is the European introduction of the mute swan, which mute swans are owned by the royalty in Europe, and they're the queen swans, but they were brought by our ancestors, and in some areas are causing problems. If you have been around Bend for 20 or 30 years, there used to be about 30 or 40 mute swans on the Deschutes River around Drake Park, and anyway, they were causing a lot of problems. They almost drowned somebody in a kayak one time because they're very aggressive. And anyway, the city didn't want the swans, and so for a while back in the 90s, we were trying to replace the mutes with trumpeters, and there's still one trumpeter on the river down below First Creek Rapids. It's a captive bird. But anyway, to tell the difference.
Yeah.
How do you tell the difference? Anybody?
Just like the bill. Delicious.
Well, with the tundra, on the bill, they have a yellow spot, so what I use.
A little tear on the tundra swans. That's the first thing you should look for. But that's kind of tough because only about 80% of those tundra swans have that little teardrop, and about 3% of the trumpeter swans get a little yellow dot there, which makes it even worse. Yeah, so that's not a black and white issue, but that works. These guys are bigger than these guys. This is to scale pretty much, but one thing that I look for is that if you focus on the eye, on a tundra swan, especially from a distance, this eye looks separate from this mask of the bill, and this eye is part of this mask, and you have this big wedgy back, kind of a 45 angle here on this big thick wedge going back to the mask of the eye, and that's a good thing to look for. The best way to be sure is hear their voice, and you've probably heard Chuck out here. He's very entertaining. Mute swans, whoops, go back. Mute swans don't make much noise. They do a little kind of muffled call that I can't imitate, but I can try to do a trumpeter and a tundra swan for you. Tundra swans are a little bit like sandhill cranes. They're kind of a raspy, kind of a guttural call and high pitched. And I'll see if I can do that. Maybe. So that's not a bugle. It's more of a water. Trumpeter swans, as you've probably heard this guy, is more of a... Anyway. It's a nice clear note. And snow geese are much smaller. They have black wingtips. They're not swans. People think they are sometimes. They got this little grin patch, but you know, swans don't have black feathers on them anywhere. They have black feet, sometimes yellow feet. There's a small percentage of trumpeter swans that have, they're leucistic birds, which is kind of like albinism, and they have yellow feet instead of black feet. And I've never seen that in tundra swans. But the head, going back, this head shape is very angular. Yet some of the behavioral things, if you watch swans in the wild, trumpeters do a lot of head bobbing. So they do a lot of displaying to their mate, and there's a lot of head bobbing going on. And when they get ready to fly, the tundra swans will take off running on the water with their neck straight out. And the trumpeter swans will take off with their neck bowed up like this to take off and fly. So you look for that snake-shaped neck. That's another good character. Okay. So not all of the tundra swans have that yellow teardrop in it. They tend to have a little bit rounder skull on the tundra swans. These guys are kind of like canvasbacks and redheads. Redheads have a very round-shaped skull and face with head. And these are very angular. So that's another thing. So the adult male is a pin. The female is a cob. No, the female's a pin. The male's a cob, and the young are called cygnets. And they're cute little guys. Some of you probably saw the twins out here this summer. Hard not to love. So a little history. This map was put together by Winston Banco in a monograph in 1960, which is a classic document about trumpeter swans and showing the breeding range. And it doesn't show Oregon in that breeding range. It doesn't have anything here on the East Coast. And since this map was put together, there are some papers talking about there were swans down in some of these eastern states, seaboard states, and I'm going to talk more about Oregon and California a little bit. But anyway, they're pretty widespread across the continent historically, and pretty abundant. But did they breed in Oregon? There are no nesting records before the 1950s in Oregon, but there are some records during the summer. They know Lewis and Clark documented lots of trumpeter swans wintering on the lower Columbia River, which is now Portland, Vancouver country. They were in the Willamette Valley. They were in the Central Valley of California in wintering numbers. We know that because they started market hunting, and they were showing up in the markets in California in the harvest, feed those hungry settlers. There's a record in June 1922 in the Blitzen Valley at Malheur Refuge. June is breeding season. And if you think about this, back in the last half of the last century, how would you find a swan nest? They're out in these big, deep marshes. People weren't doing aerial surveys, so they could easily miss them. And there's a record in Dayton, Oregon in May, which is breeding season, and early September is before they migrate, which also suggests kind of a local breeding bird, Davis Lake here in Central Oregon. So there's some records during the nesting period, which if they weren't breeding around here, they wouldn't be this far south. They don't start migrating usually until late November, leave their breeding areas. But here's this guy. Some of you may recognize this man. John Muir, the father of Yosemite's National Park. And I ran across one of his journals, one of the books that they published about him. And he talks about his favorite birds of the Yosemite Sierra. You know, that's down east of San Francisco, a little bit east of Modesto, south of Sacramento. And he says his favorite birds of the Yosemite Sierra, he mentions the Carunca the crane, the caw of the Clark's crow, which is the nutcracker, and he says the trumpet of the swan. He says the trumpet of the swan. It's not that. So it intrigues me. In that same book, he talks about visiting. He calls it the estuary, which is where the creek runs into Mono Lake. If you know about Mono Lake, it's a saline lake down there. It's much more saline than it was historically because they ship all the water to L.A. The city of L.A. has a water right on that creek that feeds it. And anyway, he was there in June 22nd, 1853, and says there's a raft of swans in the estuary of Mono Lake. And a raft of swans in the summer are the non-breeders that aren't 4 or 5 years old yet. It's these teenagers that hang out together, and that would have been some trumpeters that would have been near their breeding area somewhere, but not, you know, they can't go to their parents' territory, so they're out hanging out together. So it just suggests that there were trumpeters much further south than we know. If you look at the last ice age, that map of the former breeding range of trumpeter swans, almost all of that was under ice. So 20,000, 18,000 years ago, they had to be further south. And so we don't know the impacts of settlement, you know, which started after Columbus. 500 or 600 years of European influence, plus the natives had some impact as well. There are pretty common in the native literature and ceremony. They used to use swan skins in their ceremonies and use their feathers for a lot of different things. Anyway, market hunting was the big factor that really decimated this species, along with a lot of cranes. The whooping crane, almost extinct, they got down to 26. This picture was taken at Malheur Lake in 1904. This is a local family there that there were, if you've been to the Narrows, it crosses the little channel, Highway 205 heading to French Glen, it's called the Narrows, where you cross the bridge. There were 2 towns historically, one on each side of the bridge. One was called the Narrows, and I don't remember the name of the other one, but they were market hunting towns, and they had a bunch of wagons there. They would shoot waterfowl and shoot grebes and herons and egrets. Egrets were very prized because their feathers were worth more than their weight in gold for women's hats or breeding clubs. Anyway, this one family, in just a few days of hunting, you can see how many swans they decimated. I think these are mostly tundra swans. But anyway, that was the big impact on swans. And the other thing that went along with that was the fur trade. Swans were traded as furs because you could sell them. And Audubon talked about his favorite writing instrument was a Trumpeter Swan quill, because that was the best solid quill for an ink pen, you know, in those days. But the Hudson Bay Company traded in swan skins, and they would, I don't know what the body feathers are good for bedding, for pillows and bedding, and so. But if you pluck the body feathers off and leave the down on the skin, and tan that skin, it has a market value for powder puffs. And they were very valuable because powder puffs, you couldn't buy synthetic powder puffs. And think about George Washington powdered himself, you know, all the men back in Europe powdered. It was a big market across Europe and America to kill swans for their skins for powder puffs. So I can't remember the details of this, but there was one report where Fort Vancouver shipped out 17,000 swan skins in one season. So the beaver trappers were killing swans, the settlers were killing swans because they were hungry, and the market hunters on their wintering grounds were killing swans and cranes. That decimated them. In 1932, they declared, scientists at the Red Rock Lakes, yes, there were only 69 trumpeters left alive in the States. And it was really considered, along with the whooping crane and several other great egrets, several other species were considered endangered species long before we had any endangered species legislation. So Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge is a little bit west of Yosemite National Park. It's in the Centennial Valley, and this where most of those birds survived, but they were also in Yellowstone National Park. And because those areas are so isolated in the winter and had a lot of warm spring geothermal activity that kept open water, the birds could survive there without getting exposed to hunting. That's why that saved, that harsh climate saved the swans in the States. And I say the States because, you know, Alaska wasn't part of the States, and these biologists and scientists who were working on these swans didn't realize there was also some birds that survived in Alaska. It became a state in the 50s. And they didn't talk to the Canadians very well because there was about 100 birds at least that survived at Grand Prairie, Alberta as well. But still, the numbers were very, very low, close to extinction. So in the beginning, in the late 30s and going through about the mid-60s, there were some efforts to start flocks in other areas outside of Red Rock Lakes Refuge. And Malheur Refuge was one of these sites. Also Turnbow Refuge in Washington, Ruby Lake in Nevada, La Creek in South Dakota, and up here in the Yellowstone areas. Also, I didn't put it on the map, but the National Elk Refuge also had swan releases there. So at Malheur, they started in 1938 releasing swans to build a flock because they didn't want them all in one spot. So they've been in Oregon here since 1938 at least, and the releases. If you haven't been to Mal here, you should go. Go in May when the birds are really doing their thing. I mean, it's just an impressive place to be. But, Steens Mountain is in the background. If you want to go visit Steens, it's the highest place you can drive in Oregon with two-wheel drive. Go there in September. But it's a beautiful place to visit. So they started releasing these birds in 1938. This is just a graph of the population at Mal here. And I started working there in '83, which the peak is about a year or so after I started working. And the population was slowly growing, and it's gone down, and today it's about here. So I want to explain this a little bit. They used to feed them. When they first released them, they fed them at headquarters. There's a big pond there now. It's called the David B. Marshall Pond, but it's a big spring-fed pond that stays open in the winter. This is a real harsh winter time. There's that pond. There's open water out there a little bit, even when it's really cold, and it gets below zero pretty regularly in the Harney Basin. But the Fish and Wildlife Service decided that feeding them was kind of discouraging them from being natural and migrating further south where they ought to have better survival. And so that stopped in 1972, but if you remember that graph, they were still going up for another 10 years. The other thing that happened in the beginning of about 1983 was they had this huge flood in the Great Basin. Malheur Lake is a closed system, the Harney Basin, and drains into Harney Lake, which is a salt lake there in the system. In most years, it's a dry salt playa. It is today. And in 1980, it peaked in '86, I think, but the water started coming up in 1983, and it rose 17 feet. It was the largest lake in Oregon, and it swallowed up 21 ranches, big ranches around the basin. But before this flood, those swans could winter in the lake in good years, and then when it froze up, they could move to the pond and get by. And maintain a pretty good population, at least a flock up to 70 or so. But this fish, this is the common carp, and this just shows the rotenone treatment where they poison carp in the lake, and you see how many carp are out in that lake. And this carp population kind of goes up and down with the water conditions, but they basically eat all the food. And during the flood, the carp got into the pond where they wintered, ate all the food, so they were forced to winter down towards French Glen, farther south in the valley, 40 miles south, in the West Canal, which is about half as wide as this room. And and when it gets down below zero, there's one spring at 5 Mile Road, which it's called 5 Mile Spring, but it's 5 miles from French Glen. It's a warm spring. It keeps about, when it's really cold, about a quarter mile of water open in that canal. So that they went from this nice pond at headquarters and being able to feed in the lake until it froze up to this ditch. And these birds are so traditional, they learn from their parents. So the flock went from about 80 birds down to about 40 when they started wintering in the Blitzen Valley. They dropped about in half. And in 1988, it was 32 below in Burns on February 3rd. That winter, we went from 38 to 19 trumpeter swans in our count on the refuge. It lost half of them in that one harsh winter. So anyway, this is the bottleneck, and it still is. And unfortunately, the lake has been recovered, and the refuge staff are working hard on keeping the carp populations low and trying to get better food. But these swans are imprinted on where their parents taught them to be, and they haven't figured out how to go up there again yet. So that's how wired they are from what their parents tell them to do. So if we had cygnets here at Sun River that stay with their mom and dad, they would never migrate because their dad can't leave, and they'd be here. They would be resident trumpeter swans, and they'd be flying around hitting power lines and stuff. They don't act normal because they haven't learned what normal is. So just a little side note, I mentioned I started this neck collar project to study. We were trying to figure out what's going on with the swan population dynamics at Malheur in 1980, and we marked a total of 70 birds over 8 years. And I analyzed that data. This is survival rates of those birds, annual survival, and this is a 95% confidence intervals. I'm a scientist, but I don't work for the government, so I can talk to you tonight. Anyway, for juveniles, 44% annual survival. So 66% of them are dying that first year of those babies that are fledging. For adults during that study, and this is during those harsh years when the carp were high in the lake and the lake was up 47%, which is really poor for a bird like a trumpeter swan. They ought to be up around 80%. So this explains why the population was crashing, and it's because they got forced into this habitat that didn't have enough food there to keep the population going. So anyway, we started scheming. My old boss and I we had planned, we'd been working with the flyway folks and trying to figure out what we should do for the malheur birds because they weren't growing and expanding to other areas in Oregon, and we know some nice wetlands around in the Warner Basin, at Summer Lake, and the Klamath Basin. And so Dave Paulin and I did this tour. We were going to go this weekend, and it happened to be that we left on February 3rd, left Malheur, and it was a Friday, and we were going to go to the Klamath Basin and look at the rivers, the Sprague and the Williamson and the Wood River, which are very similar to habitats where the birds at Red Rock Lakes were wintering, and the rivers up there, the Snake River country, the Henry's Fork of the Snake, and stuff like that. So anyway, we made this trip, and we saw some nice habitat, and it was cold, very cold. And we got to Summer Lake that evening after followed Sprague and the Williamson, and took a bunch of pictures. And we got to Summer Lake, and there were 1,200 swans in Schoolhouse Lake at Summer Lake Wildlife Area. These are tundra swans, but we looked really hard. We counted 5 trumpeters in this flock. And so we decided that we're 100 miles west of Malheur. This is the place where we want our Malheur birds to winter because there's lots of food. It can feed 1,200 tundra swans. And there's a lot of politics with swans because the agencies, Fish and Game and Fish and Wildlife agencies get most of their revenue from hunters. And trumpeter swans are not hunted. When they signed the Migratory Bird Treaty with Canada, they declared certain species hunted species and certain species protected species. All waterfowl were hunted species. Cranes are hunted species, and because they had a tradition of hunting them before then, but even though crane populations are very low and trumpeter swan populations are very low. So tundra swans, back in 1960, they started opening tundra swan hunting, and Nevada, Montana, and Utah have tundra swan hunts, but they couldn't hunt trumpeter swans. So anyway, so we had trouble getting the flyway folks to agree to let us do this thing at Summer Lake because they didn't want to see a bunch of trumpeter swans getting in the way of their swan hunts. And it's a long story that you can ask me more in detail because I don't know if you all want to get into that, but it's politics. So it slowed us down. We didn't get going on this restoration project. This is just an aerial photo from Google Earth of Summer Lake. And this is a big salt lake, the Summer Lake itself, but all these nice wetlands up here. It's about 18,000 acres on the wildlife area. They could probably support about a dozen pairs of trumpeters. And there's some other wetlands, actually down here. We had one pair raised 3 young this year. Was it 3? 4. No. Anyway, there's other wetlands around. Cycan Marsh, which in the past has supported a couple pairs, is up in here, and also there's good area there. So we actually got started in 1991. We finally got approval, and that was because of some other politics. But we moved 26 subadults from Red Rock Lakes Refuge because they were also going to quit winter feeding. Finally, they kept feeding there because they didn't want to lose birds. But there were some other actions that were taking place at that time to move a bunch of birds around the flyway to try to get them to winter in better places. And they moved a whole bunch of birds actually to Summer Lake that aren't on this list during the winter. And these are breeding season birds that we released. So this was our first start at the Oregon project. It went through 97, and we had some pretty good results. These yellow dots are new areas that we had nesting swans. Rabbit Valley Reservoir, which is on the Crooked River near the old Gutierrez Ranch. These green trees are places we had birds summering, but they didn't nest. And so we had a nesting pair at Klamath Marsh for a couple years. We had a couple pairs at different times on the Sprague River. We had a pair for a few years at Chewaucan Marsh, which is by Paisley, and for several years we had 1 or 2 pairs at Cycan Marsh, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy. So they were spreading out and doing good things. But after 97, and I just want to show this. So we took these cygnets away from their parents. They didn't stay at Malheur or wherever they came from. And they explored. And so, they went, we had 3 cygnets that came from Malheur Refuge, moved to Summer Lake. They learned to fly there, just like the 2 here from Sun River. And they went to Independence, California, which is down by Death Valley. Came back, and 2 years later, one of the females in that group was nesting on the Sprague River. We had one bird that was seen 2 different springs. It was seen in California around Marysville, but also seen around Bear River in Utah, which is the migration route for the tundra swans. They migrate through this country and also this country. So we have a bunch of birds using the Sacramento Valley. We have birds that actually went to Western Oregon up to St. Helens and Mount Vernon. We had one bird show up in BC, so they're exploring and doing things and learning to be a natural swan that can move around the landscape. Unfortunately, I call them maverick swans, but they're learning, and there's a high risk when you're doing that because they don't know where everything is, and we lost several of those birds to power line strikes over the years that we know about. In 1997, there was a lawsuit about the swan hunting in Nevada and Utah because the service, Fish and Wildlife Service, didn't want to have hunters arrested for shooting swans, trumpeter swans, where there's no way hunters could tell a trumpeter swan from a tundra swan where they have a legal hunt. So they did this generic swan hunt and set a quota that if the state of Nevada or the state of Utah shot more than 5 trumpeters in a given season, that would stop their hunt, and they had to reevaluate their hunt and reevaluate the hunt babies. Because the intent is not to harvest trumpeter swans, but that made fun for animals, and the Biodiversity Legal Foundation upset, and so they sued the Fish and Wildlife Service. And when they did that, Oregon Fish and Wildlife said, we're not going to continue this Oregon project because we don't want. They also were trying to get them listed as threatened. I don't know why it does that, but it's not my laptop, I don't think.
Just for
Anyway, so it stopped our program, and it took them a long time to get that suit settled. They lost the suit, and we got going again in 2009 on the Oregon project. But by then, the suit was settled in 2008, and most of these pairs I showed you were gone. And in a couple cases, we still had one individual still on the nesting territory. The other one, the one up on the Crooked River, hit a power line and lost, I think, 2 cygnets of the male. And we had one male by himself at Cycan Marsh that died in 2010, but he was by himself for about 6 years on his territory at Cycan Marsh, or Chuacan Marsh. And in 2010, he died of lead poisoning, which is another problem. So we started again in 2009. I'll go through this real quickly, but today, including 2 birds here last year, we've released 62 cygnets, 32 yearlings, which are birds that are kept in captivity for a year and then released. And so a total of 94. In terms of success, at Malheur Refuge, they're down to 1 nesting pair. There's another pair on territory there that hasn't nested in the last 5 years, but there's 1 pair nesting just about every year now. In 2014, we had the very first successful nest at Summer Lake Wildlife Area in this project. And this pair raised 1 cygnet. That cygnet is the one that's having its wing looking at amputated. It's the very first. That next winter, the mother of that cygnet disappeared during the winter. We don't know what happened. She might have hit a power line, might have get coyotes occasionally kill these swans, eagles occasionally kill them. But she disappeared. So we've had some ups and downs. 2015, no nests except the one at Malheur Refuge. 2016, we had 3 nests. So we had another pair nest at Summer Lake this summer. They raised 4 cygnets, and then the pair that Simon mentioned has been at Flat south of Summer Lake, raised 4 cygnets. And there was a nest at the old, what's the name of that ranch now? It's the Trumpeter Ranch. Anyway, it's up on the Crooked River.
Saber Ridge.
They had 2 pairs, but one of them nested and hatched a cygnet, but it didn't live to fly. But Malheur Refuge had 2 cygnets that made it to flight, I think. So we had 8 cygnets. 3 new nests and 8 cygnets. Plus the 2 from Malheur. So we had 10 wild cygnets this year, which is great. So we're starting to see some results. On the downside, the male father of the pair at Summer Lake Wildlife Area this summer disappeared just after his cygnets hatched. Probably a coyote. So we lost him, and his wife has been taking care of those 4 babies all winter as a single mom. Marty St. Louis, who's the manager down there, told me yesterday, went to a meeting with him, he said he saw her with the father of the first cygnet, hanging out, so that's the guy that produced the very first cygnet that's in rehab still, so anyway, there's a little, soap opera stuff going on.
Family history there.
So some problems, I mentioned already these problems at these winter sites, they're wintering in very harsh areas and they've lost their tradition to go to areas that are more moderate or that have warmer conditions in the winter and get food easier. That's a big problem for these populations. Power lines are the major mortality factor. They kill more birds than any other factor at this point at least. That's a big challenge. There's one power line at Summer Lake that we've been working. I haven't personally done a lot of work on it. Marty St. Louis has been working with it. We've been talking about this for more than 10 years. It's the one that goes from headquarters down along the highway south. There's a pond on the west side of the highway the swans like to use, and some of those birds go back and forth and hit that line. So Marty got the power company to bury that line this year. All but one little stretch that's right next to headquarters, and the Swan Society is going to buy the markers for the wires for that stretch here pretty soon. So that's the biggest problem. It's pretty much gone. Anyway, but there's power line problems all over the place, and that's a big issue. And I mentioned lead poisoning up in Washington State, where the Pacific flyway population, the Alaskan birds winter, they're losing 200 to 500 birds a year to lead poisoning up there.
From what?
A year, a winter,
Kind of with lead poisoning.
with lead poisoning, yes.
How do they get it?
The lead came from old shot from hunting. You know, they didn't ban use of lead shot for waterfowl hunting until about 1988. And so that stuff doesn't disappear. It depends on the soil and substrate. But up in Washington, they figured out the major source of the lead, and they've got a big effort to keep swans from wintering on this one lake that has the biggest problem where they're getting it. So they've got a bunch of bamboo poles and that are in the water. It's like going through a big fence. The swans don't want to swim in there where the lead is. And they've got a bunch of streamers on them. The Swan Society had a big campaign to help them buy new poles this year because the old ones are falling in the water. But they're keeping them, they're excluding them from that chronic worst spot there. But there's still other lead in the environment, and they pick it up. There's still lead at Summer Lake. There's lead at Malheur Refuge. There's lead in every place people have hunted ducks. And it's not just hunting though. They also pick up fishing lead. So your little jigs, your spinners, your split shots, and one split shot or one lead pellet can kill any waterfowl pretty much. Depends on what they're eating, but it's a big problem. And what it does, it paralyzes their gut system, their smooth muscle, so they can still eat, but they can't get things to move. So you'll find these birds that are full of food down to about here, and then they become skin and bones, and it's really a sad way to go. And it's really hard to rehab these birds when they get mad. Shootings at Malheur Refuge, that was the second biggest factor, and there was no hunting there where the swans are. It was people driving by on the highway with their rifles and shooting swans. They also shoot cranes there occasionally. Some of they're not hunters, they're just vandals, and that's a problem. People, we had a whooping crane in Indiana shot 2 weeks ago. They shoot 2 or 3 whooping cranes a year. Crane Foundation's putting up a reward for that, but it's just a problem. It's a public education thing, and some people just have a bad attitude about wildlife. It's a problem we need to work on. Getting back to maverick swans, I mentioned we'd moved a bunch of swans to Summer Lake during the winter. Back in 91, winter of 91, 92, for 3 winters there. We moved about, I think, about 1,200 birds. Is that right? Do you know? Anyway, but they were catching them up by Red Rock Lakes at Harriman State Park on the Henry's Fork of the Snake River in the middle of the winter and moving them to different places in the flyway because those birds were trying to winter on a harsh area. And when it was 32 below on February 3rd, 1988 in Burns, it was 52 below at Harriman. And they lost about half their wintering flock that winter in '88. So they started these efforts to try to get these swans to learn new areas. And most of those birds that were moved were adults, and those adults, some of them didn't find their way home. There was pretty high mortality because of that experiment, but most of them that survived went back to their old habits, the adults. And the Fish and Wildlife Service made a big deal out of that at one of the meetings, that it was a failure, the project really didn't work, but I have to tell this story though. So here's a bird. One of those birds that was moved was a cygnet. There were some other cygnets, but they were all put neck collars on. This one female cygnet moved in '94 to Summer Lake. She was seen in Montana, Hebgen Lake, Montana, November 1995. She was in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, in November 1997. Henry's Fork of the Snake River, which is that wintering area. And then in 1999, she showed up at Summer Lake with a mate, and she had 4 babies. Next year, she had 3 babies, and 3, and 1, and 4, and 4. And she's been coming back, and she's brought 44 young swans to Summer Lake during this time in her lifetime. She may still be alive, but she lost her collar. We can't identify her anymore. And so if you want to see trumpeter swans, this is a few years back. Marty was counting these birds a couple times a month, but here's a peak of, they show up in early December and peak about 80. They drop down to lower numbers in the middle of the winter, and then this is spring migration again. So week after next, if you want to see a bunch of trumpeter swans, go to Summer Lake. They're coming back through in big numbers. Anyway, you see the pattern here. They're coming through in migration, and this is our counts in the second week of February since 2009, and we had 161 last year. And we can't count all the swans. There's a bunch of swans that are too far away. So if you take the percentage of the birds we count, there's more than 161. There's a couple hundred or so. And this flock that's moving through eastern Oregon is growing. We don't know where they're coming from. We're actually talking, Brandon, the waterfowl coordinator for ODF&W, may put up some money, and the Swan Society may find some money to actually put some radios on these birds that are moving through to learn more about where they're coming from, where they're going, and how they use Summer Lake. But it's interesting. A couple of our birds from the year before last that came from these 2 cygnets from Wyoming Wetland Society were down at Durham, California, which is just south of Chico, the north end of the Rice. This time, was it last year? Last January? Yeah. Yeah, it's February, yeah. So this is just showing that since 2009, some of the birds that have moved around. We had a bird at Turnbull Refuge from our releases in the last few years. Durham, California, Ty Valley, Crook County. This is a pair now that's nesting up there. Lake Blaine, Montana. Thompson, this bird roamed around, hit a power line at this 3rd sighting, unfortunately. Modoc Refuge, Likely, California, down south of Alturas. Those 2 birds in Durham, and one of those birds that was in Durham last winter showed up, one of them at Walton Lake, which is up northeast of Prineville. The other one went to Fairfield, Idaho, which is near south of Sun Valley. So they're exploring the landscape. Anyway, this just shows the distribution of those same birds. I just listed locations. They're moving around. Every 5 years since 1968, roughly, there's been coordinated surveys of trumpeter swans across North America. And I mentioned they were down to 69 birds. This last survey from 2015, almost 63,000 trumpeter swans in North America. We can celebrate. There are 3 populations that are recognized by the flyways, and one of them is the Pacific Coast population. Somewhere in this part of Alaska, they survived all that onslaught of hunting and so forth, and have grown. And then these birds in Grand Prairie apparently have grown, and these have merged up in here in BC, so we don't know exactly where the boundary is between these 2 flocks. But so this is the Rocky Mountain population here, and these birds in the Intermountain West are considered Rocky Mountain population as well, because that's where the stock came from Red Rock Lakes. So this is the greater Yellowstone area, they call it. This is the approximate range in Oregon. But then the other flock here is called the interior population. Those are all restoration flocks. Anybody here from the Midwest? State of, well, not Oklahoma, but state of Iowa and Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio. They all have had big restoration programs. They started in the mid-'60s, and that's when the Swan Society was established. 3 Rivers Park Districts, Hennepin Parks near, it's not very far, it's Plymouth, Minnesota. Anyway, they kind of started the Swan Society. That's where our office is. We're in an office space there now. But anyway, this interior population, they've done all this work for 30 years almost. They had 17,000 trumpeters in this last survey. No, where's the number? 26,000. 17,000 in Minnesota alone. So Minnesota really boomed. But so the interior population has grown bigger than the Pacific Coast population, which has always been the healthiest flock. And the Rocky Mountain population is almost 12,000. However, south of the Canadian line, we've only had 765 adult birds, which include the Oregon birds, the Montana birds, the Wyoming birds, the Washington birds, and Nevada birds. And 765 is not a healthy flock. So this is what the Swan Society is focused on. It's one of our we had two critical problems we're trying to deal with. One is loss of winter habitat for these Pacific Coast birds, which mostly winter in the Skagit and Washington counties. In Washington, they're losing their farmland habitat to development. And the other big issue is these restoration flocks, these western flocks, aren't growing. So this western flocks, which includes the Oregon birds, are really a strategic priority for the Swan Society. So we're working on a broad partnership with all the western states and the other partners like land trusts and Audubon folks and a bunch of different conservation groups. There are extinction risks for some of these sites because of their isolation. And this behavior, like I talked about, contributes to that isolation because they don't find other swan flocks. They don't move around the landscape. And climate change is another threat, as you know. It's getting warmer and wetland hydrology is changing, and so it's harder to maintain these deep wetlands that swans like. And their genetic diversity is very low, which limits their adaptability. So those are issues we're working on. We're going to try to improve connections, build what's called a metapopulation, which means your populations interact with each other and connect. And if you lose a little population in one spot, there's birds around somewhere else that can fill in that hole. That's kind of what metapopulation means. So those are the issues we're trying to work on. I just wanted to show this graph of the trend. This is the Rocky Mountain population. The total is 11,000. So here's the trend line, which that shows kind of an exponential growth. Those are the birds up in Canada. Here's our U.S. flock. And so this line, this green line, the Canadian birds, increasing almost 1,000 a year. In the U.S. flocks, we're bumping up to about 6 per year. That's pretty pathetic. That's not an increase. And actually, if you look at this graph, I blew this up, there was a dip in here in the 80s after those harsh winters and things that we were below the 530 for a while when it started with. So things aren't going well here in the West, and that's what we really need to do a lot of work on. So these are most of these projects here in this Rocky Mountain range have been started since 1990. These are restoration areas now. Originally it was Red Rock Lakes and Yellowstone, and these other refuges, Gray's Lake, Bear Lake, Seatskiddy. There's some places on the Green River in Wyoming, the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. And then they've got projects on the Middle Madison River, the Blackfoot Challenge, and the Flathead Reservation. They're slowly building this flock, and that's why we've got this slight increases because of all this other efforts, but it's not going very well yet. So anyway, we have a lot of challenges to deal with to try to maintain these guys. And I already mentioned this, the behavior, because they don't move around much if they're with their parents. We need to focus on that. This is just off the top of my head. These are just some of the major sites that I know about that are probably good trumpeter swan habitat. There's some nice wetlands in the Catlettle Valley that actually had a nesting pair 20 years ago. Malheur Refuge has got good nesting habitat, not good wintering habitat. We've had nests in the Silvies Valley in the past, years ago. The GI Ranch has had some swans there, Crooked River Wetlands, Summer Lake, Sycan Marsh, Klamath Marsh, Upper Klamath Refuge, Tule Lake, Lower Klamath Refuge in California. So there's all these sites that we should occupy with swans at some point. And that's what we're trying to do, is not to have them all be at Summer Lake, but have Summer Lake as their wintering focus and migration focus, and then spread around the landscape. And then also, here's Oregon again, but maybe connect them up to Ladmarsh Wildlife Area and the wetlands around there. White River Wildlife Area has some wetlands, and then in the Washington State, there's Toppenish, Convoy Lake, McNary, Columbia Refuge, and of course Turnbull already has swans. But try to build this connection so that the Turnbull birds come to Summer Lake, and we have this connection up and down the flyway through the states, and hopefully connect them over here. I want to diverge a little bit and talk about Turnbull Refuge. It's one of the restoration flocks I mentioned. They quit feeding in 1972, just like Malheur did. They had about 50 swans in 1972. Those swans didn't migrate, and the population drastically dropped down to one bird, which they named Solo. And he was alone at Turnbull for almost 20 years. And in 2007, he found a mate. So this is his brood in 2007. 2008, they raised a brood, so they raised 2 broods. Solo died of lead poisoning after his second brood. Everybody was crushed. That year, his wife found a new mate, and apparently one of his children found a mate, because there were 2 pairs now. There's 2 pairs of Turnbulls. So there's some hope that there's some connection starting to grow in the flyway to these birds. And just this, some of the sites in Washington State that I think are great swan habitat. Toponus Refuge in particular has some huge wetlands that are really good looking to me. So, as I said, we want to establish connectivity among all these flocks, and we have to figure out how to get Ruby Lake birds saved as well. They're down to 2 pairs, 4 birds. They're not very connected to anything else. So that's the problem. So we're trying to work on that. There's another wetland right here called Fish Springs National Wildlife Refuge. It might be a good connection point. So that's my talk. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
What do you think the carrying capacity of Malheur would be if the water situation is even normal?
Well, okay, the carp problem limits that a little bit, and it's considerably. The very first carp didn't show up in the lake until 1950, even though they were apparently in the Silvies River in the 40s, early 40s. But carp wipe out all the food. So if you talk about the Blitzen Valley and Double O, which they can pretty much manage the carp. We had, in 1 year at the most, we had, I think, 23 different nest sites going at the same year. So it would easily support 25 pairs if the lake was in good shape, and the refuge staff are working really hard to figure out how to minimize the carp impacts and hopefully eventually eliminate them, but probably another 20 pairs on the lake. But I mean, well, maybe not 20, because it's so dynamic. It could be 5,000 acres 1 year and 40,000 acres the next, but the lake could support quite a few more pairs as well.
And also, if we're wandering around bird watching or whatever, and we see swans, is there a place to report as far as the population, as far as what we see?
The Swan Society has a program called Trumpeter Watch, and so you can look it up on our webpage, swansociety.org. We're mostly focused on trying to document new winter sites, but we'll take any. Put your data on eBird, because we're looking at eBird for swan breeding distribution sightings. So that's what I would. But if you have a winter record, and if you have a neck-collared marked bird, report those. You can always report them to me too. So I work real closely with that data and stuff. But eBird and us, Trumpeter Watch, which is a wintering swan project.
Yes. So back in the day, they hunted swans and they ate the settlers. They hunted swans and they ate them. Were they doing that simply out of they needed to eat, or were they particularly sought after because they tasted good?
I think it's a little of both, but I think if you were out there as a pioneer family trying to carve out a little farm, have some cows, and you'd get pretty hungry, wouldn't you? I mean, there's no safe way. They might bring in some jerky on a wagon that you could buy some salt pork or something, so anything fresh. Market hunters shot shorebirds. They shot things like white-faced ibises for food. They sold them on the markets in San Francisco. Ibises are carnivores. Shorebirds are carnivores. They're eating vertebrates, snails and worms and things like that. And they're not very tasty if you've eaten that kind of stuff. Ducks that eat a lot of protein aren't very good to eat, but people were hungry, they would eat anything. So I think it was just kind of the way of life. It was tradition. You just, if you had a swan or any kind of big bird around, the parallel stories of Samuel Cranes in Oregon. And do you folks know about Peter French and the Blitzen Valley? Peter French is this big cattle baron that owned the Blitzen Valley, which is now 40,000 acres of Malheur Refuge. He owned the Catlow Valley, the Diamond Valley. He had these huge ranches, the Round Barn and Long Barn and sod house barn are all Peter French. He had this huge landscape that he controlled because he was an honorary cattle baron, and he ran all the settlers, the homesteaders out, kept them out. And if you read the Birds of Oregon in 1940, they talk about there were about 100 cranes left in Oregon. Most of those were in the Blitzen Valley and the Albert, which was, Blitzen Valley was Peter French's ranch. And the only reason they were saved is because he wouldn't let people get into his private property. There were 3 or 4 pairs in the Cascades that survived. So they were down to 5 pairs in California in the 1940s, and they went extinct in 1941 as a breeder in Washington State. So there was harsh, intense pressure by the settlers and by market hunters on the wintering grounds for those species because of the demand of food. There's an old reference that cranes were selling for $20 a piece during the Christmas season in San Francisco back in 1920. That's a lot of money for 1920. Anyway. Yes.
Is there any efforts right now to track the genetic diversity of them, actually map out the genealogy?
There's a researcher, Sarah Euler McCants, who's done a lot of genetic work on swans, trumpeter swans. They're the least diverse waterfowl species anyone's ever looked at genetically. And there's she was able to separate 2 population types. And the Pacific Coast population, the Alaska birds that come into BC, and the Rocky Mountain type. There's no other type. There's 2 divergent types which are very, 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 very similar. There's enough difference that she could tell the population differences.
But it seems like that might be a good goal to connect those 2 populations to increase the.
Well, the interior population, which is doing very well, is a mix of birds from both those flocks, and they're growing like crazy. And so that's something we're talking about. Some of the states, Wyoming and Montana, aren't sure they want to mess with their genetics. So I'm going to a meeting at West Yellowstone next week to talk about that. We're trying to get that changed and be able to use more Alaska flock in our releases. But Oregon, we got that approved a few years back. Oregon and Washington.
Swans a lot.
Yeah. You had a question?
Yeah, barring some calamity like lead poisoning or power lines or whatever, what is the life expectancy of a
About
trumpeter swan?
20 to 30 years. So they go for, they usually don't nest at the minimum maybe 3-year-old if they're lucky, but 4 or 5 is when they start laying eggs generally. And they've got about 10 years of production, after that 10 or maybe 15 if you're really lucky. And if they're in a good habitat, cranes and swans, big birds like this, a small percentage of the population raises most of the young because they've got the best territories with the most food, and they tend to have bigger broods and tend to produce more birds. So there's some limits. If Summer Lake filled up, there'd be some pairs that wouldn't do very well because they're out on the edge and don't have a good habitat. So there's carrying capacity limits on their territories too, and the quality of the food in the territory would kind of limit their production over time. But 20 years is probably a pretty good average for a trumpeter.
For population, was artificial insemination discussed, or does that work with swans? Or?
Only if they're in captivity.
Okay.
If you had a wild bird and you did that, that would be pretty disruptive. They'd probably abandon the territory and wouldn't last.
Do you know how old Chuck and Grace are?
I don't know. Grace showed up on the Deschutes River. We found her when she had a little Rapala fishing lure in her tongue about 4 years ago.
About 4 years ago, yeah.
But we don't know her origin or how she ended up there because somebody dumped her. She was pinioned, and so we don't know how old she is. Chuck, the Swan Society bought Chuck and Larry, 2 brothers from, they came from the Kellogg Bird Sanctuary in Michigan. Kellogg cereals, that's one of their nonprofit facilities. It's kind of like a zoo. I don't know all that they do. But anyway, they were 3-year-olds, and we got them, I think, in 2009 or 10. So I'd have to go back to my records to get the exact, but they were 3 years old. So they're, what is it today? It's 2017. So they're about 10 years old each, roughly. Yeah.
What keeps Chuck and Grace here? Are their wings clipped?
They're pinions. They lost the wrist of one wing. Just that little tip.
So what happens? How do they stay here?
They veterinarians remove the wingtip, it's like the wrist,
Okay.
you know, it's the last, here's the wing,
Right.
the elbow, and the radius,
take
all
the
that,
wrist off.
they take the wrist off, so that one wing is not functional, and they can't fly,
Okay.
Why would they do that?
because they don't want them flying.
No power
If they
lines.
fly, they hit power lines,
Oh, because of where they are.
yeah, because of where they are, right?
And just add a little thing there, as Gary's been talking about, to try to get this flock going, it's about numbers. I mean, naturally, you're gonna lose a lot of cygnets anyway, so the more we can bring in, the faster things will start to rebound. But we don't have just not the numbers out there that we can bring into Oregon. So the only way we can supplement that is with breeding that we can somewhat control. So there's a pair, the pair that are here, Larry and Grace, and then we have, actually we still need to
Chuck
find
and Grace.
sorry, Chuck and Grace. And then Larry is at Pronghorn, we're trying to find a female for him. The female was killed by a coyote. And so it's like, you know, one step forward and two steps back. But the whole point is, with these captive breeding, they're not truly captive, they can't fly, so we know where they're gonna be. We'll keep them breeding, that helps to supplement the cygnets, so we can take down the Summer Lake to keep the engines running.
One thing more about Chuck and Larry, and I didn't name them. I think Jay did.
I think they were
No, they
neat
were
when they
getting
got
forward
here.
on them.
Did they?
Yeah.
I didn't. Maybe the Sun River guys, or the Pronghorn people might name it. But anyway, when we got them, what we learned about them is that they were descendants of some birds that came from England. They've got zoos in England, and they were birds that were sent from Alberta to the Queen as a gift in 1640. That's their great ancestry. So they were birds from way back.
More than I
They are
do, but
royal
I-
trumpeter swans with very important genetics that probably aren't represented very well in the flock, so they're very, very cool swans.
That's what we call them.
Regal.
What do they do in the winter here and the protection of like maybe you talked about this like up here a few minutes, like with fox and coyotes and stuff.
Well, they have to keep, they have to keep vigilant. Coyotes are probably the biggest threat here. If they're sleeping, they could sneak up on them and grab them.
Yeah, because a little island.
But I think that they've probably seen enough raccoons and coyotes that they're pretty.
They can flutter enough to get away from.
Oh yeah, well they stay close to the water, and of course those mammals can't swim very well.
Yeah, and we keep the water open out here with a bubbler all winter long, so
Oh.
they have access to water.
And doesn't freeze.
Not that part, it's
Yeah.
gotten a lot smaller this winter.
Yeah, they really need that open water. They can't spend the winter on the ice.
Are we hoping they'll have another pair? And as
Well, they could have a bigger brood. I would expect a bigger brood this season.
a bigger brood every time they have brood?
Well, the average brood size is 4 to 5,
Okay.
and the first year they usually lay a smaller clutch. I think they only had 2 eggs, didn't they?
They leave 4 eggs,
Four
there's
eggs.
only
They
2
have 4
hatched
eggs.
this year.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So anyway, I would expect that one more would hatch this year. I hope, cross our fingers, in case the raccoon doesn't get their eggs or something like that.
So what keeps the egg from hatching? Because they had 4.
Well, it could be infertile.
The 2 are infertile.
Yeah, they could be infertile, or they could also get chilled sometime during incubation if the embryo can die.
And when is that usually at? Spring?
They usually start nesting about mid-May. Start laying. There was a question behind you there.
Gary, how old are the cygnets when they can fly?
They're about, they start flying about 100 days or so, but probably 120 before they really fly like a swan. They have to practice a little bit. We like to move them to Summer Lake about a week before they're flying well, so that's the first place they learn to fly and explore. And I should tell you too, another little backstory, the bird that's in rehab, we took those 2 Sun River cygnets to Summer Lake, and a couple days before or after that, we took 5 cygnets from Wyoming and released them in the same pond at Summer Lake. It's a big wetland. And we had 5 Wyoming cygnets and 2 Summer Lake cygnets. And Marty said a couple of days after that, there were only 4 Wyoming cygnets. One of them disappeared, probably a coyote. And anyway, he has a photo, which I forgot to put in my talk, but there's a photo of this bird that's in rehab. She's got a green neck collar, leading the 2 Sun River cygnets and the 4 Wyoming cygnets around the pond there, teaching them the ways. And she was flying around with those birds. They learned to fly with her. She was leading them around like she adopted them. And she was shot flying with that flock.
Oh.
And that's why that other bird was killed. He was with her. So anyway, it's a small world out in the swan world, and we hope that she gets back into business for us.
You mentioned that, that the pair that was brought from Canada in the 1600s. Are there other captive, in zoos and places, trumpeter swans in different places around the world with a genetic variation that might be
We don't,
valuable?
I don't know if that's true. By the time, I don't know. I don't think so. There was a lot of work before my time on swans back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. They were doing a lot of work with swans, but most of the swans that went into the zoos came out of Red Rock Lakes over the years. And most of the swan stock that's in the zoo system came from Red Rock Lakes after the 30s when they discovered that's where they were left, and they were taking eggs and very young birds out of there for zoos for a while. So I don't think so, but it could be somewhere. I don't know where they would be. Maybe in Germany or France. I don't know. I really haven't researched that, but I kind of doubt it.
But that is another source of cygnets that we are
Yeah,
tapping
zoos.
into.
We're getting
Yeah.
actually more from zoos some years than we get from the other programs. So
Yeah, I would think that variation of genetics adding to these very small populations would be a huge plus. If you can do it.
Was it the Cincinnati Zoo this year that had a huge clutch? Like 8? There was a bunch of babies. I think it was the
I don't-
Cincinnati Zoo.
well, the Cincinnati Zoo sent two newly hatched cygnets to Washington, which were raised in Whatcom County Humane Society, and they were sent to Summer Lake too from there. But I don't know about. They may have had another brood. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not even totally sure if that's where it was, but I just remember watching a nest cam and it was
We're getting birds
several
from the
babies.
Alaska Zoo. We've got them from Lincoln, I think Lincoln, Nebraska. There's 3 or 4 different zoos we get birds from, depending on what they have every year. They're going to Summer Lake when they're cygnets.
Do you have a recommendation, or do you have papers out or a book out about swans and all this?
There's a lot of information on our webpage for the Swan
Okay,
Society.
good.
That's where I'd send you. There's not one. There's some technical books. There's a monograph on swans by Winston Baker. You can find a lot of information out though. If you just Google trumpeter swan biology and things like that.
Okay, but
But,
no book.
There's no real one particular book. There's a book called Swans of the World somewhere out there that I don't think is that good for learning about trumpeter swans, but somebody needs to write one. Somebody.
I think that's you.
I have a long list of things I'm writing on.
Thanks again, Gary, for coming out. Thank you, Simon, from the SNCO coming out and answering some questions for us as well. I appreciate that. You could catch more from Gary. I think this guy has more Oregon Field Guide episodes than anybody in Oregon. So, what is it, 3 episodes that are about you? On Oregon Field Guide, OPB?
I think there's 5.
So we will have more lectures coming up, just so you guys know. So stay posted to our webpage, the Sun River Scene, things like that, because we've got lots more coming. And we will bring Gary back and he'll talk to us about cranes, because he knows some stuff about those as well. So thank you all for coming out.
And for those of you who are interested, we're hoping to put up the Swan Cam again, the webcam this year, if they end up having another nest. So stay up to date on that one.